When desperation knocks at midnight, rain hammered against the windows of the modest apartment building as Nina Carter settled into her worn armchair with a cup of chamomile tea. At 26, her life had fallen into a predictable rhythm of work, worrying, and the occasional stolen moment of peace, like this one. She reached for the medical bills stacked on her coffee table, her stomach knotting as she calculated the growing debt from her younger sister Emma's treatments. The sharp knock at her door made her jump, hot tea slashing onto her hand. She glanced at the clock, 9:45 at night. Nobody visited her at this hour. Nobody visited her at all, really. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Julian Ashford, her boss and CEO of Ashford Global Enterprises, stood in her doorway looking nothing like the composed titan of industry he wore every day. His charcoal suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, and his usually perfect black hair fell across his forehead in disarray. His steel grey eyes, normally so calculating and controlled, held a wild edge of desperation. "The impossible request, Nina," he said, his deep voice strained. "I need your help, not as my assistant, as something more." She stepped back instinctively, her mind racing. In 3 years of working for him, Julian Ashford had never come to her home. He barely acknowledged her existence beyond her efficiency in managing his impossibly complex schedule. "Please, come in," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He paced her small living room, a caged animal, his presence making the space feel even smaller. The Zhao Investment Group confirmed their attendance at tomorrow's gala. He began without preamble. "Thomas Zhao is flying in from Singapore. The Asian expansion deal depends entirely on securing his $50 million investment." Nina nodded, slipping into her professional mode, despite the surreal situation. "That's wonderful news, Mr. Ashford." "No." He cut her off sharply, then softened his tone. "It's a disaster." He stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. "Zhao is traditional, extremely so. He mentioned to my business partner that he was looking forward to meeting my wife at the gala. He assumed a man in my position would be settled, married, stable. Understanding dawned slowly. Then all at once, Nina felt heat rush to her face. "You need someone to pretend to be your wife for the evening. The weight of necessity at someone," Julian said, taking a step closer. "You." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so uncharacteristically vulnerable it made her heart ache. "I can't trust anyone else with this. You know me better than anyone, Nina. You know how I take my coffee, what I'm thinking before I say it, every detail of my life. A stranger would make mistakes. You wouldn't." Nina's mind reeled. The request was absurd, impossible. She thought of her quiet life, her Sunday visits to the hospital to sit with Emma, the simple dreams she harbored of a life beyond being invisible in someone else's world. This was a line she never imagined crossing. "I can't," she whispered. "It's too much. It's a lie too big to tell." She watched his jaw tighten, saw the desperation in his eyes intensify. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. "I know about Emma." The devil's bargain. Nina's blood ran cold. "What?" "Your sister's medical bills," he continued, his voice gentle but inexorable. "The experimental treatment her doctors recommended. The one insurance won't cover. I know it's why you work 70-hour weeks, why you never take time off. I know the debt is crushing you." Tears stung her eyes. "How dare you?" she breathed. "I can make it disappear," he said urgently. "All of it. The debt, the treatment costs, the best specialists in the world for the rest of her life. Everything, Nina." He stepped closer, his gaze boring into hers. "I can save your sister. All I need is one night, just one night as my wife." The apartment fell silent except for the rain drumming against the window. Nina's hands trembled. She thought of Emma's pale face against white hospital pillows, of the hope that had drained from her parents' eyes month by month as the bills mounted. She thought of the experimental treatment that could give her sister a real chance at life. "Forever out of reach. One night," Julian repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Please." Nina looked into the eyes of the most powerful man she knew, now brought to his knees by circumstances beyond his control, and saw her own desperation reflected back at her. She thought of Emma's laugh, the way it used to fill their childhood home before the sickness came. She thought of what she wouldn't do to hear that laugh again. The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. Yes. Crossing the line, Julian's entire body sagged with relief. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you, Nina. I promise you won't regret this. I'll have my lawyers draw up the agreement tonight. The payment will be transferred immediately. As he turned to leave, pulling his composure back around himself like armor, Nina called out softly, Mr. Ashford. He paused at the door. After tomorrow night, we go back to normal. You're my boss. I'm your assistant. Nothing changes. He looked back at her, and for a moment something unreadable flickered across his face. Of course, he agreed. Nothing changes. But as the door closed behind him and Nina sank onto her couch, her heart pounding and her hands still shaking, she knew with absolute certainty that everything had already changed. She had just agreed to step into a world she didn't belong to play a role she wasn't prepared for, with a man who saw her as a solution to a problem. What she didn't know, what neither of them could have predicted, was that sometimes the most elaborate lies can reveal the deepest truths, and that one night can change the course of two lives forever. The rain continued to fall as Nina sat alone in her apartment, a contract wife before the contract was even written, wondering what she had just agreed to, and if her heart would survive the consequences when pretend becomes personal. Morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's executive office as Nina stood before his mahogany desk, feeling like an actress about to audition for the most important role of her life. Julian had transformed back into the controlled CEO she knew. Crisp navy suit perfectly pressed, every hair in place. Only the faint shadows under his eyes betrayed the previous night's desperation. On the desk lay a black leather folder, and Julian flipped it open with businesslike efficiency. I've prepared our story, he began, his tone clipped and professional. We met 2 years ago at a charity auction for children's hospitals. You were there volunteering. I was immediately drawn to your kindness and intelligence. He recited facts like he was presenting a quarterly report. Their first date at an Italian restaurant, a weekend trip to the coast, a small private wedding 6 months ago attended only by immediate family. He had created a timeline, bullet points, a complete fabricated history of a relationship that had never existed. Nina listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, until he finished. Then she shook her head gently. This won't work. The heart of the matter, Julian's brow furrowed with irritation. I've covered everything. The timeline is consistent. The details are plausible. It's not about the facts, she said softly, standing her ground. Thomas Zhao isn't going to quiz us on dates and locations. He and his wife will be watching how we interact, how we look at each other. She met his gaze steadily. No one will believe we're married if we act like strangers, reading from a script. Julian stared at her, clearly caught off guard. Then what do you suggest? We need to build something real, Nina said, her voice growing stronger. Not a real marriage, but real familiarity, real comfort with each other. We need moments we can reference, memories we actually share, even if we create them just for this purpose. She took a breath, knowing what she was about to propose would shift the power dynamic between them. Take me to dinner tonight, not as your assistant preparing for a business event. Take me to dinner as if I were actually your wife. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian Ashford, the man who commanded boardrooms full of powerful executives, looked utterly lost. For the first time since she'd known him, he had no answer, no strategy. She had just rewritten the rules of his carefully constructed plan. An evening of discovery. Julian picked her up that evening at 7. Nina barely recognized him. Gone was the corporate armor. He wore dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made his grey eyes look like storm clouds. He held a single white orchid, her favorite flower, though she'd never told him that. He must have noticed the small plant on her desk. You look beautiful, he said, and the genuine surprise in his voice made her blush. She'd chosen a simple burgundy dress, nothing fancy, but the way he looked at her made her feel like she was wearing couture. The restaurant he'd chosen wasn't one of the exclusive establishments where he typically conducted business dinners. It was a cozy bistro with exposed brick walls, soft lighting, and the warm aroma of fresh bread. They sat across from each other at a small corner table, and for the first few minutes, they fell into their usual pattern, discussing schedules and meetings. Nina gently placed her hand over his on the table, stopping him mid-sentence. "Julian," she said quietly, "I'm not your assistant tonight, and you're not my boss. We need to learn about each other as people." He looked startled, then slowly nodded. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with work." Unveiling hidden dreams, Julian was silent for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, tinged with an old longing. "Before I took over the company from my father, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I used to spend every summer at my grandmother's beach house, studying tide pools for hours. I dreamed of diving the Great Barrier Reef, discovering new species, understanding the ocean's mysteries." Nina watched the transformation in his face as he spoke, seeing passion replace the usual calculated control. "What happened to that dream?" "My father had a heart attack when I was 23, Julian said simply. "The company needed leadership. There was no one else. The ocean became something I looked at from penthouse windows instead of swimming in." The vulnerability in his confession hurt deeply. "And what about you?" he asked, turning the question back to her. "What does Nina Carter dream about when she's not managing my impossible schedule?" She smiled, feeling her own cheeks warm. "I want to open a bookstore cafe in a small coastal town, somewhere with big windows overlooking the water, mismatched furniture, the smell of old books, and fresh coffee. A place where people can come to escape, to find stories that change them." She paused, then added quietly, "Emma and I used to plan it together before she got sick. We'd spend hours designing it, naming it, choosing which books we'd stock." Julian listened with such focused attention that it made her nervous. "Why haven't you done it?" "Because dreams cost money, and money goes to keeping my sister alive," she said simply, without bitterness. "Some dreams wait, some dreams have too." The moment everything shifted as they left the restaurant, Julian insisted on walking her home despite the late hour. The city streets were quiet, lit by street lamps and the occasional passing car. They walked in comfortable silence, closer than they'd ever been before, their shoulders occasionally brushing at her apartment door. Nina turned to thank him, but the words died on her lips. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something raw and uncertain, and achingly human. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for tonight, for reminding me that there's more to life than balance sheets and profit margins, for seeing something in me I'd forgotten was there." The space between them felt charged, electric. Nina's heart hammered in her chest. Then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Julian leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her cheek. His lips were warm, the gesture achingly tender. It lasted only a moment, but it sent shockwaves through her entire body. "Good night, Nina," he whispered against her skin. "Good night, Julian," she managed, her voice barely audible. He stepped back, looking as shaken as she felt, then turned and walked quickly to his car. Nina stood frozen in her doorway, her hand rising to touch the spot where his lips had been. Her skin tingled, her heart raced, and her mind screamed warnings she couldn't quite hear over the rushing in her ears. It was just a kiss on the cheek, she told herself as she closed the door and leaned against it. Just a friendly gesture between two people preparing to deceive powerful investors. But the way her hands trembled told a different story. The way she could still feel the warmth of his breath on her skin, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air around her. All of it whispered a dangerous truth she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The line begins to blur that night. Nina lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. In one evening, Julian Ashford had ceased to be just her demanding boss. He'd become a person with dreams deferred and vulnerabilities hidden. He'd become someone she could imagine caring about. And that terrified her more than any lie they were about to tell. In his penthouse across the city, Julian stood at his window overlooking the glittering skyline, But he wasn't seeing the view. He was seeing Nina's face as she talked about her bookstore dream. The way her eyes had lit up with a passion she never showed at work. He was feeling the ghost of that moment at her door when he'd kissed her cheek. An impulse he hadn't planned, couldn't explain, and definitely shouldn't repeat. He'd hired her 3 years ago because she was efficient, organized, and practically invisible. Now, after one dinner, she was all he could see. Both of them fell asleep that night knowing that the hardest part of their arrangement wouldn't be convincing strangers they were married. It would be convincing themselves that the connection growing between them wasn't real, that it was all just part of the performance, that one night could end without leaving permanent marks on both their hearts. The gala was tomorrow. The deception would begin in earnest, but the truth, the dangerous, complicated truth neither was ready to face, had already taken root, and some truths, once planted, refused to be uprooted. When the curtain raisest morning of the gala arrived with the weight of inevitability, Nina stood in her small bedroom, staring at the garment bag that had been delivered to her apartment at dawn. Inside was a gown that cost more than 6 months of her rent, a deep emerald silk that seemed to shimmer with its own light. A note in Julian's precise handwriting was attached: "For tonight, you'll outshine everyone there." Her hands trembled as she unzipped the bag. This was really happening. In a few hours, she would step into a world of wealth and power where she'd never belonged, on the arm of a man who'd barely noticed her existence until he needed something from her. Her phone buzzed. Julian's message was brief: "Car arrives at 6. Trust me, Nina. We can do this." But could they? Could she stand beside him and pretend to be the woman who'd captured the heart of one of the city's most powerful men? Could she look into his eyes and light a room full of people who built fortunes on reading others? She thought of Emma, of the transfer confirmation that had arrived in her bank account that morning, of the call from the hospital saying the treatment could begin immediately. She thought of her sister's chance at life, and she knew she would walk through fire for that chance, even if it meant risking her heart in the process, becoming someone else. When Nina emerged from her building that evening, the woman who stood there bore little resemblance to Julian Ashford's efficient assistant. The emerald gown hugged her curves before flowing to the ground in elegant waves. Her dark hair was swept up, exposing the graceful line of her neck, where a diamond pendant Julian had also sent sparkled in the fading sunlight. Professional makeup artists he'd hired had transformed her features, highlighting cheekbones she didn't know she had, making her brown eyes look luminous and mysterious. Julian stood beside the sleek back car, and when he saw her, he went completely still, his mouth parted slightly, his grey eyes widening as they travelled from her face down the length of the gown and back up again. For a long moment, he simply stared. "Nina," he finally breathed, his voice rough. "You're absolutely stunning." She felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You don't look so bad yourself." That was an understatement. In his tailored black tuxedo, Julian looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread, but it was the way he was looking at her, with unconcealed admiration and something deeper she couldn't quite name, that made her pulse race. Into the Lion's Denth Grand Regency Hotel's ballroom was a palace of crystal chandeliers, white marble, and elegant excess. Women dripped with diamonds, men wore watches worth more than cars, and everywhere Nina looked, she saw the kind of wealth that existed in a different universe from her own. Julian's hand found the small of her back, warm and steady through the thin silk of her gown. "Stay close to me," he murmured in her ear, his breath sending shivers down her spine. "Just follow my lead." They moved through the crowd, Julian introducing her again and again. "This is my wife, Nina." Each time he said the word, it sent a strange jolt through her system. The ease with which he claimed her, the pride in his voice, it all felt dangerously real. Then she saw them, Thomas Zhao and his wife, MEI, approaching through the crowd. Thomas was a distinguished man in his early 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes. MEI was elegant and warm, her smile genuine as she reached for Nina's hands. "The crucial test, you are the woman who finally tamed our Julian," MEI said warmly, her accent melodic. Thomas and I were beginning to think he would marry his work. Nina smiled, letting herself relax into the role. Some men are worth the wait, she replied, glancing at Julian. He just needed to find someone willing to see past the boardroom persona to the man underneath. She felt Julian's hand tighten slightly on her waist, a gesture invisible to others, but electric to her. The four of them sat together for dinner, and Nina found herself genuinely enjoying May's company. The older woman was witty and kind, asking questions that felt more like friendly curiosity than interrogation. She wanted to know how they'd met, what Nina loved about her husband, what their life together looked like. Nina wove truth into fiction, describing Julian's hidden passion for the ocean, his rare but transformative smiles, the way he looked when he finally allowed himself to relax. She described the man she'd discovered over their dinner the night before, and every word rang with sincerity because it was real. Across the table, Thomas and Julian discussed business, but Julian's attention kept drifting back to Nina. Their eyes would meet, and each time, the air between them grew heavier with unspoken things, the dance that changed everything. When the orchestra began playing, couples flooded the dance floor. Julian stood and extended his hand to Nina. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Ashford?" The false name on his lips sent another shiver through her. She placed her hand in his, and he led her to the center of the floor. The moment he pulled her into his arms, the rest of the ballroom seemed to fade away. His hand on her waist, her hand on his shoulder, their other hands clasped between them. They began to move, and it was nothing like their practice session in the boardroom. This was effortless, natural, as if they'd been dancing together for years. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. "MEI adores you." "Thomas is impressed. Is that all this is to you?" Nina heard herself ask. "A performance." His grey eyes locked onto hers, and she saw something in their depths that made her breath catch. "I stopped performing the moment you walked out of your building tonight." The confession hung between them, heavy with meaning. The orchestra swelled, and Julian spun her out, then pulled her back flush against him. They were closer now, barely a breath between them, moving as one entity to the music, the kiss that broke the roulette. "Can see them watching us from the terrace," Julian whispered, his lips near her ear. "We should give them something to see. What did you have in mind?" she asked, though her racing heart already knew the answer. "May I kiss you, Nina? Not as my assistant, not as part of a deal. May I kiss you as a man who hasn't been able to stop thinking about you since last night?" She should have said no. She should have maintained the professional boundary, protected her heart, remembered this was all temporary. Instead, she found herself nodding, her eyes drifting closed as he lowered his head. His lips met her softly at first, a gentle question. But when she responded, threading her fingers into his hair, the kiss deepened into something fierce and desperate. 3 years of professional distance burned away in seconds. His hand tightened on her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted into him, losing herself in the taste and feel of him. The ballroom disappeared. The mission, the investors, the elaborate lie, all of it ceased to exist. There was only this, his mouth on hers, his heart pounding against her chest, the overwhelming rightness of being in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, they stared at each other in shock. That wasn't pretend. That wasn't for show. That was real, raw, and absolutely terrifying. From the terrace, Thomas nodded approvingly to MEI. "That is a man in love," he said with satisfaction. He was right, but for all the wrong reasons. Or perhaps all the right ones. The unraveling begins. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Nina and Julian played their parts perfectly, but something fundamental had shifted. Every touch lingered too long. Every glance carried too much weight. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and both of them knew it. When Julian finally helped her into the car at the end of the night, the silence between them was suffocating. The driver pulled away from the hotel, and neither of them spoke. The city lights streamed past the windows, illuminating their faces in flashes of gold and shadow. "Julian," Nina finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, What just happened in there? He turned to her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her heart ache. I don't know, he admitted, but I think we both know it wasn't part of the plan. They arrived at her apartment too soon. He walked her to her door, and they stood in the dim hallway, neither wanting to end the night, both terrified of what continuing it might mean. Thank you, he said softly. For tonight. For everything, she nodded, unable to trust her voice. He reached out, his fingers gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, that tears sprang to her eyes. Good night, Nina. Good night, Julian. She watched him walk away, then closed her door and leaned against it, her legs finally giving out. She sank to the floor, still in her beautiful gown, and let the tears come. She'd agreed to one night as his fake wife, but somewhere between the practiced smiles and the choreographed touches, between the scripted conversations and that devastating kiss, something real had taken root, and Nina had no idea how she was supposed to go back to being invisible now that he'd finally, truly seen her. The terrifying part wasn't that she'd fallen for Julian Ashford. The terrifying part was that she was almost certain he'd fallen for her to. And neither of them had any idea what to do about it. When reality crashed in, awoke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window and the phantom sensation of Julian's lips on hers. For a brief, beautiful moment, she forgot about the complications, the lies, the impossible situation they'd created. Then reality crashed down like a wave, leaving her breathless and aching. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. 3 missed calls from her mother, undoubtedly checking on Emma's treatment, to messages from colleagues asking about the gala, and 1 email from Julian, sent at 5 in the morning. Meeting with Joe at 10 a.m. We'll keep you informed of the outcome. Thank you again for last night. The formal tone of the email felt like a door slamming shut. Nina sat up, hugging her knees to her chest, and tried to sort through the tangled mess of her emotions. What had she expected? That one kiss, no matter how earth-shattering, would transform their entire relationship? That Julian Ashford would suddenly see his assistant as something more than a temporary solution to a business problem? She'd been a fool to let her heart get involved. She'd been a bigger fool to think his might have followed. The ice returned. Julian sat in his office, exhausted but unable to rest. The meeting with Zhao had gone perfectly. The $50 million investment was secured. The Asian expansion was moving forward, and by every measurable metric, his gamble had paid off spectacularly. So why did he feel hollow? He'd barely slept, his mind replaying every moment of the previous evening. The way Nina had looked in that emerald gown, the easy grace with which she'd charmed the joust, the feel of her in his arms on that dance floor, and that kiss, that devastating, world-altering kiss that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with feelings he had no right to have. She was his employee. She'd done him a favor, and he'd compensated her generously for it. The professional thing, the right thing, was to maintain distance, to let her return to her normal life without the complication of his confused emotions. So when she arrived at the office Monday morning, he greeted her with cool professionalism. Good morning, Miss Carter. The Zhao deal is finalized. Your bonus will be processed with this week's payroll. I trust we can return to normal operations. Nina stood in his doorway, and he saw the flash of hurt in her eyes before she masked it with her own professional smile. Of course, Mr. Ashford. I'll have your schedule ready within the hour. The formality between them was a knife's edge, sharp and painful. The pretense crumbles for 3 days. They maintained the charade of normalcy. Julian buried himself in work, taking meetings back to back, staying late at the office. Nina performed her duties with mechanical efficiency, speaking only when necessary. Avoiding his eyes. It was torture for both of them. On Thursday afternoon, Julian called her into his office for what was supposed to be a routine briefing. But when she entered, he was standing at his window, his shoulders tense, his hands shoved in his pockets. Close the door, he said quietly. She did, her heart beginning to race. He turned to face her, and the carefully controlled mask he'd worn all week had cracks in it. I can't do this anymore. Nina. Do what? She asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. Pretend, he said, his voice rough. Pretend that nothing happened. Pretend that I don't think about Saturday night every waking moment. Pretend that kiss didn't change everything. Nina's breath caught. Julian, don't. Why not? He took a step toward her. Because it's inconvenient. Because it complicates the professional relationship. Because it scares you as much as it scares me. All of those things, she whispered. And because I know how this ends. You'll realize this is just residual emotion from the performance. And I'll be left picking up the pieces of my shattered heart. I can't be your assistant if I'm in love with you, Julian. I just can't. The confession spilled out before she could stop it. And the moment the words left her lips, she saw his eyes widen with shock. The confession, you love me. He breathed. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Of course I do. You impossible man. I've been half in love with you 4 months, maybe longer. But I buried it because it was hopeless and inappropriate. Then you asked me to play your wife. And I got to see the man behind the title. And I fell completely. So yes, I love you. And that's exactly why I can't work for you anymore. She pulled an envelope from her pocket and placed it on his desk. My formal resignation. 2 weeks' notice. Or I can leave immediately if you prefer. Julian stared at the envelope like it was a bomb. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw raw emotion swimming in his grey eyes. You think what I feel is residual emotion from a performance? His voice was low, intense. Nina, I haven't stopped thinking about you since the night I showed up at your apartment. Every conversation, every moment we spent together preparing for that gala, showed me parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. He moved closer, and she found herself backing up until she hit the door. That kiss on the dance floor, he continued, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. That wasn't for show. That wasn't for the joust. That was me, finally having an excuse to do what I've wanted to do for weeks. To kiss you, to hold you, to stop pretending I don't feel something profound and terrifying when I look at you. The truth at last. Nina's heart hammered against her ribs. Then why did you pull away? Why did you treat me like a stranger this week? Because I'm your boss, he said, pain evident in his voice. Because the power dynamic makes any relationship between us complicated at best, unethical at worst. Because I was trying to do the right thing, give you space, not pressure you. His hand came up to cup her face gently. But I realize now that the right thing is also the most cowardly thing. The right thing is telling you the truth. What truth? She whispered, though her heart was already soaring with hope. That I've fallen in love with my brilliant, kind, impossibly patient assistant. That you've become the most important person in my life. That the thought of you leaving, of losing you, is unbearable. He leaned his forehead against hers. I love you, Nina Carter. Not as an employee. Not as someone playing a role. I love you as the woman who reminds me that there's more to life than profit margins, who sees me as a person instead of a position. The tears came harder now, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming emotion. I love you too, she said against his lips. So much it terrifies me. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears. So what do we do now? Nina asked. The office has policies about relationships between executives and staff. Julian's smile widened. Then I suppose we'll need to find you a new position. How do you feel about being director of strategic planning? It's the same level as my other executives, completely separate reporting structure. Are you offering me a promotion so you can date me? I'm offering you a promotion because you're brilliant and underutilized, he corrected. The fact that it also allows me to take you to dinner without HR complications is just a bonus. Nina laughed, the sound bright and free. I accept both the position and the dinner. They stood together in his office, holding each other. The weight of pretense finally lifted. The lie they'd told had led them to a truth neither had expected. That sometimes love finds you in the most unlikely places, with the most unlikely person, at the most unlikely time, and sometimes, just sometimes, Fake arrangements lead to real feelings. Temporary agreements become permanent commitments. And one night changes everything. A new beginning that evening. They walked through the city together. No longer boss and assistant. No longer pretending. Just a man and a woman finally honest about their feelings. Julian held her hand, and Nina leaned into his side, both marveling at how natural it felt. So, Julian said, a teasing note in his voice. About that bookstore cafe dream of yours. What about it? How do you feel about oceanfront property? I happen to know a small coastal town with a beautiful building for sale. It has big windows overlooking the water. Nina stopped walking, staring at him. Julian, I can't let you buy me a bookstore. I'm not buying you anything, he said seriously. I'm investing in a business I believe in, run by someone I trust completely. Consider me your first and most enthusiastic investor. Besides, he added with a grin, someone needs to introduce me properly to the ocean again. I've been away too long. She threw her arms around his neck, kissing him soundly in the middle of the sidewalk, not caring who saw. You're impossible. So you keep telling me, he murmured against her lips. You're stuck with me now. Promise. Promise. Always. The word hung between them, the same word he'd had engraved in the ring he'd bought for their charade. But now it meant something different. Now it was a vow, freely given, honestly meant. One night as his fake wife had indeed changed everything. It had shown them both what they could have, if they were brave enough to reach for it. And as they walked together into their future, hands intertwined, hearts aligned, they both knew that this was just the beginning of their real story, the one they would write together, without scripts or pretenses, just a people who'd found unexpected love in the most unlikely of circumstances. And that, they both agreed, was the best kind of story of all. 6 months later, coastal breeze carried the scent of salt and coffee through the open windows of Chapter and Cove. The bookstore cafe that had transformed from Nina's dream into a reality. The space was everything she'd imagined: exposed wooden beams, mismatched vintage furniture, walls lined with carefully curated books, and large windows offering a panoramic view of the ocean. Nina stood behind the counter, pouring a latte with practiced ease, her smile genuine as she chatted with a regular customer. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She wore a simple sundress, and she looked more at peace than she'd ever been in her years of pencil skirts and corporate efficiency. The bell above the door chimed, and Julian walked in, still wearing his suit from a morning video conference, but with his tie loosened and jacket slung over his shoulder. His whole face lit up when he saw her. The transformation from serious CEO to besotted man instantaneous. Is this seat taken? He asked, gesturing to the empty stool at the counter. That depends, Nina replied, her eyes twinkling. Can you promise not to reorganize my filing system or optimize my inventory management? No promises, he said, leaning across the counter to kiss her softly. How's your sister? Healing and hope Ema's doing wonderfully, Nina said, her voice thick with emotion. She called this morning. The doctors are calling her progress remarkable. She's talking about going back to college in the fall. Julian squeezed her hand. I'm so glad, Nina. She deserves every good thing. The experimental treatment he'd funded had worked better than anyone had dared hope. Emma was in remission, growing stronger every day, and had even visited the bookstore last month, pronouncing it absolutely perfect and demanding a job as soon as she was well enough. So, Julian said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. I have something to show you. Nina opened it, her eyes widening as she read. This is a lease agreement for the space next door. Julian nodded, looking almost nervous. The shop's been empty 4 months. I was thinking we could knock through the wall, expand, add more seating, maybe a small performance space for readings and book clubs. He paused. That is, if you want a business partner, a real one this time, not a pretend husband. The questionina set down the envelope, her heart beginning to race. Julian, what are you really asking me? He stood, moving around the counter to stand in front of her. He took both her hands in his grey eyes intense and full of emotion. I'm asking if you want to build something permanent with me, Not just this bookstore, but a life, a real one, with no scripts, no performances, no expiration dates. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Nina's breath caught. 6 months ago, I put a ring on your finger as part of a lie, Julian said, his voice rough with emotion. It said always, and at the time, that word terrified me because I didn't believe in always. I believed in quarterly projections and calculated risks. He opened the box, revealing a stunning sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds, the deep blue of the ocean they both loved. But you taught me that the best things in life can't be calculated or controlled. You taught me that love isn't a risk. It's the only thing worth being certain about. The answer, Nina Carter, Julian said, his voice breaking slightly. Will you marry me? Not for a business deal, not for one night, but forever. Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I see you, I choose you, I love you, in every moment, in every way that matters? Tears streamed down Nina's face as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Yes, she finally managed. Yes, Julian, always yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she threw her arms around his neck, kissing him as the handful of customers in the cafe erupted in applause and cheers. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing and crying at once. The sapphire caught the light streaming through the windows, sending blue sparkles dancing across the walls like light on water. 3 months later, the real wedding took place not in a grand ballroom, but on the beach behind Chapter and Cove, with the ocean as their witness and the sunset painting the sky shades of gold and rose. 50 people gathered on the sand. Emma, healthy and radiant, serving as maid of honor. Thomas and Emmy Ijow, who'd become genuine friends. Nina's parents, a handful of Julian's executives, who'd watched the transformation in their boss with amazement, and regular customers from the bookstore who'd become like family. Nina wore a simple white dress that flowed in the ocean breeze, her feet bare in the sand, wildflowers in her hair. Julian wore a linen suit, also barefoot, looking more relaxed than anyone had ever seen him. When it came time for the vows, Julian took Nina's hands, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, carrying over the sound of the waves. Vows written on the heart, Nina. I came into your life asking you to play a role, to help me convince someone that I was more than just my work. What I didn't know was that you would show me how to actually become that person. You didn't just play my wife for one night. You showed me what it means to build a life worth living. He took a shaky breath. I promise to always see you, to always choose you, to support your dreams even when they scare me. I promise to take long walks on the beach and read books that have nothing to do with business. I promise to be your partner in every adventure, your comfort in every storm, your biggest believer in every dream. I promise you forever. And this time, I know exactly what that word means. Nina's voice trembled as she began her vows. Julian, you came to me in desperation, and I agreed to help you out of necessity. But what started as a transaction became the greatest gift of my life. You saw me when I was invisible. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You funded my dreams, but more importantly, you dreamed with me. She smiled through her tears. I promised to challenge you, to keep you humble, to remind you that life is measured in moments, not mergers. I promised to dance with you in empty rooms and kiss you in crowded ones. I promised to build this beautiful, messy, unpredictable life with you, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one love at a time. I promise you always, and I finally understand that always isn't just forever. It's every single day, choosing us. The beginning of Oasis, the efficient pronounced them married. Julian pulled Nina into his arms and kissed her as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting them both in golden light. Their guests cheered, and somewhere overhead, seagulls cried out as if in celebration. Later, as the reception continued with a bonfire on the beach and dancing under the stars, Nina and Julian stole away to the water's edge, their fingers interlaced, their feet in the gentle surf. Do you ever think about that night I showed up at your apartment? Julian asked, How different things could have been if you'd said no. Every day, Nina admitted. And I'm grateful you were desperate enough to ask, he laughed. I think we can agree that was the best worst decision I ever made. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the moonlight dance on the waves, both marveling at how a desperate gamble had led them here. To this moment, to this life. So, Mrs. Ashford, Julian said, pulling her close. What grand adventure shall we embark on next? Nina leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. Well, Emma starts working at the bookstore next month. The expansion is almost complete, and she turned in his arms to face him, her eyes sparkling with a secret. I was thinking maybe in about 7 months. We might want to think about expanding in other ways too. It took Julian a moment to understand. Then his eyes widened, his mouth fell open, and pure joy transformed his features. Are you telling me? I'm pregnant, Nina confirmed, laughing as he spun her around before setting her down gently, as if she were suddenly made of glass. We're having a baby, he breathed, his hands shaking as he cupped her face. Nina, we're going to be parents. The perfect ending, the beautiful beginning. As they walked back to their celebration hand in hand, Nina reflected on the journey that had brought them here. One desperate night had indeed changed everything, but not in the way either of them had expected. They'd set out to deceive others and ended up discovering truth. They'd pretended to be married and found real love. They'd crafted a temporary arrangement and built a permanent foundation. The bookstore they'd built together was thriving. Emma was healthy and happy. Julian had learned to balance ambition with life, to measure success in moments of joy rather than just profit margins. And Nina had discovered that she was stronger, braver, and more capable than she'd ever imagined. Years later, they would tell their children the story of how they met, carefully edited, but fundamentally true. That sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected ways, that the bravest thing you can do is choose honesty even when a lie seems easier, and that the best relationships are built not on perfect beginnings, but on the choice to keep showing up, keep trying, keep loving. They would teach their kids that always isn't just a word you engrave in a ring. It's a daily choice, a constant recommitment, a promise you keep even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. As the stars emerged overhead and the fire crackled on the beach, Julian pulled Nina into a dance, their bodies moving together with the ease of long practice and deep love. Around them, their friends and family watched with smiles, recognizing what everyone could see. To people who'd found each other against all odds and chose each other every single day. One night as his fake wife had changed everything, but it was every night after, every morning, every moment of choosing to be real, choosing to be vulnerable, choosing to love without pretense or protection that created their forever. And as Nina rested her head on Julian's shoulder, feeling their baby growing within her and watching Emma laugh with joy by the firelight, she knew without question that this, all of this, was worth every risk, every fear, every uncertain step that had led them here. Their story had begun with a desperate proposal and a reluctant agreement, but it had become something neither could have scripted, a love story built on truth, tested by time, and proven in the quiet, daily choice to build a life together. The ocean whispered against the shore, eternal and constant, bearing witness to their beginning, their middle, and all the beautiful moments yet to come. And somewhere in the stars above, the universe smiled, knowing that sometimes the best love stories start with a lie and end with the truest truth of all. Love, when it's real, when it's right, when it's chosen freely, is always worth it. Always.